Well, it's that time again when people start talking about the potential for communist China to wage war and invade Taiwan, which is known as the Republic of China. Most people don't really know the history there. That Taiwan, that we know today, the Republic of China, is a rump state. It used to be the non-communist government of all of China, including, I believe, Outer Mongolia, as well as I think there's a little bit to the west, maybe, that I can't remember where exactly. I think there might be more territory even that communist China today still doesn't control, that was controlled at one point by the Republic of China. Well, anyway, in 1949, as we know, Mao took over, and Chiang Kai-shek, the old non-communist dictator, fled to Taiwan. And ever since then, his collaborators, or he himself until I think about 1971 or so, have just been, holed up on Taiwan, and they've been doing quite well for themselves. Taiwan's a very prosperous island. They've got a lot going on. They produce a lot of computer chips. They produce computers themselves. They produce other things. They used to produce cheap plastic toys. They've moved on from that. They went through all the stages of industrialization. They're now a very advanced country. But at the end of the day, they do not stand a chance militarily against communist China if the government in Beijing, the CCP, ever decides to take them back. What Taiwan has relied on is an implicit commitment from the United States, the world empire, to defend its sovereignty against communist China. And I guess the conventional wisdom here in the United States is that old Joe Biden is viewed as such a weakling that the Chinese think, hey, now's our chance because Joe Biden is so weak, he wouldn't actually try and defend Taiwan. We can just march in there and take it. It's not like Taiwan can put up much of a fight. And we will be victorious. And so, we're seeing a lot of harsh rhetoric from China regarding Taiwan. We're seeing them fly sorties over Taiwan and try and intimidate them. And unfortunately, there is a pretty loud contingency here in the United States that's saying, oh my gosh, the America has to defend Taiwan in the case that they're invaded by China. We got to go to war with China over this relatively big island. I'll give them that. It's a big island in the Pacific Ocean. And that, to me, is some kind of crazy. There is absolutely no justification for the U.S. going to war with China over an island that's right off the coast of China that we might prefer, as free people, is not controlled by communist China. We look at that government as people in the West, I would hope in general, and say, you know what, that government in Beijing, they're not so good guys. I wouldn't want to live under that government. And the people of Taiwan probably wouldn't want to live under that government either. That's why they elected a very different government than the one they have in Beijing. But ultimately, at the end of the day, trying to stop Taiwan from being absorbed into the People's Republic of China would mean nuclear war, because Beijing and Washington are both nuclear powers. You don't, go to war with another country that has nukes. You don't do that. Mutually assured destruction prevents countries like China and the United States from ever going to war in earnest. And if you actually did try to go to war, well, your mutual, destruction would be assured. China would start lobbing nukes at the U.S. The U.S. would start lobbing nukes at China. Sure, China doesn't have a lot of nuclear weapons that we know of, not nearly as much as the U.S. or Russia. I'm pretty sure it's undisputed that the U.S. and Russia have by far the most nukes in the world. They could both, each one of them could, blow up the entire planet like 12 times over. But that doesn't mean that China's nuclear arsenal could not devastate much of the known world. Certainly, California, which, hey, I'm not a fan of California, but I don't want them to get nuked. Japan, I am a fan of Japan. Definitely don't want them to get nuked, but they would under this scenario. Taiwan itself would probably get nuked. Other countries, and certainly the United States. I'm sure China has plenty of ways of getting a nuclear missile over to the United States, and it would not end well. And so at the end of this war, let's say the United States wins, which I think they very well might eventually. Although, you look at a situation like Afghanistan, but they would be different. This would be, a conventional war, which is what the U.S. military is set up to accomplish, fight a conventional army. There would be an island that they would have to defend. So that's something that the U.S. military has a good record on. If you look at World War II, what was that? That was all about playing capture the flag with a bunch of islands in the Pacific. That's the U.S. military's bread and butter, capturing and defending islands in the Pacific. But in order to, secure Taiwan, they would have to completely wipe out mainland China, they would have to sink their navy, which, the Chinese navy, not that huge of a threat. It's not that big. So there wouldn't be that many ships that the U.S. would have to take out. It really would just be the nukes. That would be the big sticking point there, the nuclear weapons. Now, let's not also forget, the conventional ballistic missiles that China has. I believe China's got plenty of conventional weapons that they could lob at Taiwan or any U.S. Navy ships that happen to be in that part of the world. So there would probably be heavy casualties before any real victory over there. But again, none of this would be worth it. This huge major war, the first nuclear war in human history, that's not worth it. I like Taiwan. I wish them well. But I'm not willing to sacrifice a good chunk of the human population, potentially, for their sake. I feel the same way about Taiwan. I think it's terrible what the British did to Taiwan, completely, abandoning those people and jettisoning them, handing them over to a pack of wolves, because that's what the British did. But at the end of the day, I don't think that the U.S. military should step in and correct that. If the U.S. tried to, invade and capture Hong Kong, even if they captured it for a short time, they wouldn't be able to hold it, because Hong Kong is right there on China. It's a port city in China, even though for a long time it wasn't controlled by the Chinese government. It's still like in their country. It's like Guantanamo Bay. The only reason why the U.S. is able to maintain Guantanamo Bay is because, Castro's a little fish in a big pond. But communist China, they're a big fish. So at the end of the day, could the U.S. Keep China from, regaining these historical, these historic Chinese territories, which have been that the communist government has not been able to, assert control over in the time of their existence, the last holdouts against communism in Greater China? Yes, I do think that is something the U.S. is capable of. But again, it's not something the U.S. should ever do. I was listening to old Gordon Chang, who some of you may be familiar with, today on the radio. He was a guest on Clay and Buck. It was interesting. I was very curious to hear what his justification would be, because I can't remember who it was, Clay or Buck. But they asked him, hey, Gordon, you're talking to the average person. What is, the average American's, interest in Taiwan? Why should they care about what happens to Taiwan? Why should they want, the U.S. to defend Taiwan in a war? And I'll give him some credit in that, he initially did say, hey, if we get to the point to where there is an actual war, it's already too late, which I would agree with. That's 100% the correct position. If we get to the point to where there is a war between, where Taiwan tries to invade China, that's way too late. You can't do anything by then. But what Chang was essentially saying is that the U.S. should, make credible threats that they will defend Taiwan, all the way up to the last minute. But he even said the U.S. should ratify a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan, which would mean that the U.S. actually would need to go to war to defend Taiwan, which would seem to contradict his earlier point about, well, by the time China invades, it's too late for the U.S. to do anything about it. And sure, you can say, hey, the U.S. should try and deter China and act like we're going to, we're not going to, if you invade Taiwan, you're going to be starting a nuclear war. And maybe that will be enough to keep them off of it. But at this point, unless you get somebody in there who's real convincing, I don't know how you're going to make the Chinese feel like the U.S. president, whoever it is, cares more about Taiwan than they do, because that's what it comes down to. Whoever's willing to take that risk of starting a thermonuclear war is the guy who cares more about owning and controlling that island. And I think that the CCP is going to take the bet that they care about Taiwan a lot more than the U.S. does, and that at the end of the day, if they really want to go and take it, the U.S. knows it just doesn't make that much sense to try and control it. And by the way, I forgot to say earlier about old Gordon Chang. I have a lot of trouble taking him seriously because his book, The Coming Collapse of China, is 20 years old this year. 20 years ago, he wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China. How's that working out for you? And I don't necessarily even disagree with his thesis that, China has a big debt. China's essentially a big debt bubble. It's a Ponzi scheme. I agree with that, but this idea that the collapse of China is right around the corner, I'm not willing to go out on that limb. And I think that old Chang would have a lot more credibility if he didn't continually go out on that limb himself. Now, I guess before I go, I should address one of the concerns of the people who really, would like to defend Taiwan. And again, I would like to. I just don't think that it's practical. And here's one reason why. A lot of people say, gee, it's domino theory. If Taiwan falls, it's just like, the Sudetenland. Once Hitler took the Sudetenland, well, then he was emboldened and he wanted world domination. Well, first of all, Hitler, never really wanted world domination. He wanted domination over Europe, just like Napoleon. Napoleon, I believe, was the one who gave independence to Haiti. But I don't want to get off topic. But the idea is, hey, the Chinese, if they are able to conquer Taiwan, well, then they're just going to try and take over the world, and they want to be the next America. They want to be the global hegemon. And I would argue that's not necessarily the case, and that is not even most likely to be the case. China is a very old country. They're a very old empire. They consolidated their empire a few thousand years ago. It stayed about the same size. It had, pretty similar borders for a very, very long time. Longer than any of the, nations in Europe really have ever, have even existed. Certainly China has had pretty similar borders and stayed in their own sandbox for longer than the United States has existed. And so the aberration here, really is the fact that the U.S. Holds influence over these historically Chinese territories at all. And so I think, from an imperialist standpoint, the Chinese look at Taiwan and they just say, hey, this was historically a part of our empire and we want it back. It's just like Putin with Crimea. Putin going in and taking Crimea was not, the start of, that was not Putin's Sudetenland, where now the Putin was able to take Crimea, he's got to conquer all of Europe. No, that was never going to happen. The same is true with China. China captures Taiwan. They're not going to go for world domination. It's not like, oh, today Taiwan, tomorrow Hawaii. No, that's not what the Chinese are going to do. The Chinese want their historic empire back, and they want to be the most powerful state in Asia. That's about it, I think. I don't think that China wants to conquer Europe. I don't think China wants to conquer the Americas. I think they want to be respected and powerful. Which is, goes beyond them being communists. I think that, this is a bit of just more, traditional Chinese imperialism. And it's not something that I like necessarily, but I just have to look at it objectively and say, you know what? Is that worth thermonuclear war to prevent? No, I don't think so. So, you can't look at the world in terms of how you'd like it to be. You have to look at the world in terms of how it is and, different trade-offs. Hey, if this, then that, or this, then that. What's the best option? Remember, another thing that people say a lot is that, oh, well, you can't let China, be the imperial power in the Pacific. That needs to be the United States because, if we didn't, if China became the imperial power in the Pacific, well, that could threaten trade routes. It's like, wait, threaten trade routes? Trade routes to where? Where people talk about, oh, well, we import all this stuff from East Asia. We got to have safe passage for the freight ships coming to and fro. And we can't let the Chinese control that. We got to have the Americans do that because China could shut down all trade. And it's like, well, wait, where's that trade? Who's that trade with? Where's that trade coming from? Oh, yeah, it's coming from China. So if the Chinese wanted to cut off trade with the West or the United States or whoever, they wouldn't need to control the oceans to do that. They could just close their own ports. It'd be a lot easier. They could just say, you know what? No, we're not going to ship any more stuff to you. We're going to cut you off, Westerners, and we're going to keep all this stuff to ourselves. So there's a ridiculous idea that we need the U.S. needs to be the imperial power in the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean needs to become an American lake in order to keep the trade routes to China from being cut off by China. Again, these are not happy decisions, but these are the decisions that have to be made. And at the end of the day, there's no good reason for the U.S. to go to war with China over Taiwan.